Well, let me say welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Excited to have you with us for this fourth and final session of ECU's, East Carolina University's 6th Annual Civility Summit. I'm Dennis McCunney, use he, him pronouns. I serve as Director of Intercultural Affairs here at ECU. Let me get us started by sharing a brief overview of the Civility Summit and some of our goals with the program. Some of you who've been here for previous sessions have heard this already, so bear with me as I repeat that just to kind of frame our conversation today. The Civility Summit provides opportunities for students, faculty, staff, and community member attendees from the state and region to engage in conversations about civility and how it intersects with topics such as activism, race, politics, sexual orientation, gender identity, and global affairs. The overarching goal of the event is for these conversations to fuel participants' desires to make changes in themselves, which would aid their work in becoming positive change agents. Our summit goals and learning outcomes include things like promoting democratic values within our campus community, encouraging unity in the face of public divisiveness, honoring active citizenship as a daily practice and inspirational goal, encouraging students to creatively engage in constructive conflict, and promoting steady, loving confrontation, or Dr. King's definition of nonviolence, to promote a more just and equitable world. Historically, we've designed this summit as a half-day conference to discuss some of these issues. And this year we decided to change the format a little bit and solicit some input from our global partners to engage with the topic of building peace after conflict, and really relying on our friends at Amizade to help facilitate these conversations. So we're really grateful for that and our partnership with Amizade. So our title, or our topic for this series is Building Peace After Conflict, and perhaps a more apt title would be Building Peace Within and Among Conflict, as this conflict seems ever present in our current social and political reality. As you know, for all of us in the US, it's been a difficult and exhausting year, divisive and tragic summer of violence and racial injustice, and we're seeing that reality continue in Minneapolis, as well as a charged election season culminating in extremist acts of violence at the US Capitol, on top of serious public health challenges brought on by the pandemic. In many ways, many of us feel as if our social fabric is torn and tattered. Questions like, how do we heal? How do we move forward? And how do we rely on our deeply held democratic principles to keep us moving in a positive direction? As you'll see from the Civility Summit website, through the help of our Fair Trade Learning partner, Amizade, we've offered 4 90-minute sessions over the past 4 weeks addressing this topic with guest speakers from around the globe. Their experiences and perspectives within their own local contexts shed some important light on this discussion. And so we have the recordings available for the last 3 sessions on the website, on the program website, and we encourage you to check those out if you're curious about some of the content of those conversations and dialogue. I want to thank our Intercultural Affairs team here at ECU for helping to put this together. Katie Locke, Sean Simon, and Tara Kermit. And if you have questions about previous sessions or the way we've designed this, feel free to reach out to myself or Katie. Katie can't be here today, but feel free to reach either one of us. So with that as an introduction and a way to get us started, I'm going to pass it off to Brandon today, or Nick.
Thank you so much, Dennis. Yeah, thanks, Dennis, and thanks to our friends at ECU. This has been a real treat the last few weeks, getting to share some of our network around the world's perspective on everything from individual experiences of countering extremism to very large collective considerations on how we build peace after conflict. This has been a real wonderful experience for all of us here around the world. So thank you for offering a microphone to some of our friends. As Dennis said, this is the fourth and final part of the series. We hope, though, that this is just really the starting point for a larger conversation in and around the ECU community around how we can build peace after conflict. Today, we're going to be traveling down to Parkland, Florida, to visit, listen, and share with our friend Matt Deutsch. But before we begin, let me just, and again, this is going to be a review for some folks who have been on previous sessions. Who's Amizade? What are we doing here? We're a 26-year-old nonprofit organization based in Pittsburgh. We work with a lot of education partners like East Carolina University all over the world and in over 20 communities. Fun fact, we actually don't work in Parkland, Florida. So this is like really just an extension of our network that blurs kind of where we're coming from and where we're going to, who we're listening to, and who we're sharing with. But our organization really does three things, and you can see why Parkland isn't too far outside of our wheelhouse, because we try to bring diverse groups of people together, folks who would otherwise never be in the same room, whether that's in person or virtually. We try to inspire empathy and civic engagement, and I think our conversation today with Matt, there are a few young people, a few groups of young people as the movement he's a part of that have ever in American history inspired as much civic engagement as the March for Our Lives movement. And then finally, we hope that it's not just that we're inspiring something in this room and we're bringing people together who wouldn't be in this room, but we're kickstarting some action together. That action piece is very important to what we try to do as an organization. The way we do this is typically through study abroad and virtual experiences that focus on concepts like climate change, anti-racism, ending extremism, which is what this series has been about, and community development all over the world. We also have United Nations consultative status. We work with government agencies in multiple places around the world. We do some corporate social responsibility work. We have over 26,000 alums. As long as we're able to connect diverse groups of people and inspire and kickstart some sort of social action, we're doing our job. So we don't work with one specific group of people. We work with all people. Our recipe today and in all of our virtual experiences is that we try to do one part compelling story, a little bit of data in there, and then one part action as well. All right. And so, I think today is no different in that we're going to have some real inspiration here, real human interaction, but also my hope is that everyone leaves here with some concrete things we can do about some of the challenges that we're talking about. So just to recap a little bit about how we got here and some of the conversations we've had. In week one, we were off in Northern Ireland, and actually, since we've been there, things have deteriorated actually with our community partners in all sorts of directions. There's been some street violence. If anyone saw the international media stories of or images of a peace wall mural being blown up, Amizade actually has a very important connection to that. We helped to paint that mural 10 years ago, and it was on the front page of every publication pretty much on Earth. So we send our best to our friends there who are fighting a new form or reemergence of extremism, we could say, as the pandemic kind of winds down in Northern Ireland right now. But that week we considered the rise of extremism in the United States through the lens of some folks who are on the opposite sides of the Troubles. We heard stories about the Troubles, individual stories, collective stories. And what kept on popping up that week was linkages between poverty and extremism, people in vulnerable positions and being easily radicalized. We were introduced to the trends of misinformation used to spread hate. When asked what concrete things we could do about it, John Hoey, a former loyalist extremist, we could say, said flat out, we should end the internet. We should end Facebook and social media. In week two, we went to Germany and we heard from Dr. Matthias Haas about exploring the denazification of Germany after World War II and some struggles that existed and continue to exist years later, generations later, in fact, on how to end conflict after something so severe as genocide. We discussed ways in which the victims of the Holocaust were memorialized, and while the perpetrators were held accountable. And we also considered how building peace continues years later, that it's not something that there's one court case or there's one monument taken down, but it's a process that takes generations and generations. Last week, we were with our friends in Lakota country, and thanks again to Leah for joining us today. And I hope I do justice to summarizing some of the takeaways. We heard stories of both individual and widespread community racism, and considered the lived experiences of at least one person who has worked to overcome it in his life. Furthermore, I think we, more so than in other sessions, really considered the state's role in promoting and perpetuating extremism. That this is not and has not been individual actors who have nefarious feelings or who were born into a racist structure, but actually that sometimes and too often, and certainly is the case in Lakota country, that the government is responsible for perpetuating extremism. So now for the main event. We're going to spend about an hour with our featured speaker, Matt Deutsch. Matt, I'll introduce you in one moment. I've got some good things to say about you. And then we'll spend about 15 minutes in breakout rooms, reimagining or imagining our place in our communities, and how to build peace. And then finally, we're going to reconvene, open it up for questions and final thoughts. As always, feel free to use the chat box for questions and comments throughout this discussion. And I would like to introduce a young man named Matt Deutsch, who I had the great honor of meeting about 2 years ago in California at a conference, and I was absolutely blown away. You know, I have the good fortune in life to meet a lot of cool people all over the world. We do a lot of cool things. Old people, young people, middle-aged people, boring people, funny people, all the people. And you know, a lot of the people I meet are activists. A lot of people I meet and work with have dedicated their lives to making this world a more joyful and just place, which is Amizade's motto. And I very rarely talk to people who speak in front of thousands of people. There were probably 2,000 people at this event. But after his speech, I said to one of my colleagues, I need to corner this guy. I need to like talk to him, listen to him, and learn more about what is driving him to do this work. And sure enough, I got the opportunity to corner him, and I did that. And a few months later, I found myself in Europe with him, in Holland, and then kind of bouncing around in Northern Ireland. And I found him speaking to some of our community partners in Northern Ireland and inspiring other young people, people his own age, about how to organize, about how to get active in the wake of whether it's personal crisis or generational or transgenerational crisis. But one of the lessons that I've been so profoundly inspired by is this concept of organizing, because I think what Matt and his friends have brought to the global conversation is this understanding that it's not just about raising money for justice or even doing being active in but you know, politically active, or you know, whether it be direct engagement or civil action. They're organizers. They're really good organizers, and they've used the tools of our time, social media, technology, AR, VR, all the things that I've already kind of jumped the shark on, to organize and to inspire others, and they continue to do so. You know, I have been honored to then get to see Matt a few times and talk to him throughout the pandemic, and I continue to be inspired and excited and motivated by all the things that he has boiling in that brain of his to organize young people. So without further ado, it's my real great honor to introduce a friend of mine and someone I admire, Matt Deutsch. Matt, take it away.
Thank you, Brandon. That was super nice. And yeah, it's been 2 years, which is crazy because the pandemic gives me no sense of time. I never do this on Zoom, so I'm like learning technology in front of you. I'm just sharing, not sharing, that's the wrong thing. Present. Um, so yeah, my name's Matt Deitch. I'm 23 years old. I was born and raised in South Florida. Lived in Parkland most of my life. This presentation today I'm going to talk to you guys about is Parkland and radicalization. I'm probably going to be like laid back because a lot of my public speaking really relies on like the energy of the room. Like Brandon said, like I'm actually incredibly nervous when I speak in front of people, and like I do a lot of preparation and a lot of research to feel like I can speak on these things, because I don't think that facts and truth have any restrictions besides putting in the repetitions and the time with stuff. So if you have any questions or anything while I'm speaking, or you need any clarification, or you just want to like say something that resonates with you, feel free in the chat to chime in at any time. Or like respond with the emoji things too. I usually do that when I'm like listening to lectures. So yeah, Parkland and radicalization. This is me. That picture's 2 years old, before I grew the pandemic beard. And so my background, I was born to a Reformed Jewish family. My dad was a bartender. My mom was a student, and I was their first child. They didn't know they could have kids, so I always say that I was an accident, but I like just like a joke to start it off. My dream was always to be a filmmaker. I wanted to make art. I didn't really have a reason other than I just felt like it was something I was good at, and I was constantly pushed to because my grandparents were photographers. And they did mostly photography for working and middle class people in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, New Jersey, and New York. And so they were like deeply connected to the community there, just doing work. My grandpa did all the prom photos for like an entire school county. And so it was like weird connections like that. But so I always thought that that was like a good way to like be of service to people and still like be creative. And so I wanted to go to college for film, and I didn't get into any of the schools I wanted to go to. So I went to a community college out in California. I graduated in less than a year by accident. I had to transfer campuses to Cal State Northridge. The wildfires happened, campus closed, and I was couch surfing. I slept outside a lot. I got all the way to North Florida before I realized that like I was comfortable for doing nothing for a while. And this was like only 2 years out of high school, and I already like sort of lost my path of my film dream. So I was like trying to regroup, but also just accumulating debt, doing school virtually because campus was closed, and like using public Wi-Fi and public library Wi-Fi. And so I like hit rock bottom. I really struggled with mental health. Like having your dreams sort of fall apart does that to people. But I just started learning about how terrible the world was, really. And I was watching documentaries about like different wars the US has been in my entire life, and the different people that were being displaced. And I learned about my own family's history, having been displaced through conflict hundreds of years ago. And I was like, okay, so how can I use my creativity to be of service to people who are going through the same cycle that people like my family went through hundreds of years ago? And so we came up with, I met my friend Jamal, actually dragged me out of my depression. He made me come into his garage and just start being creative and just coming up with ideas all the time. And so one of the ideas we came up with was this war and peace idea, where we were going to juxtapose war with flowers and sunshine, and peace as bombs and the manufacturing of weapons, because that was our experience being born like post 9/11. And so we had set ourselves up to record a promotional video for the fashion line. And we had two people who were going to be our models. And one of them was my friend Max Stein. nicknamed Fritz, and the other one was Joaquin Oliver, nicknamed Guac, and this was Joaquin Oliver. And so we were set to film on February 8th, and we bumped it a week because it had been a while since I had filmed anything, and we needed more time to prepare. And so I also had my sister's birthday coming up on February 14th. And so I was like, okay, so we'll film it after that. And on February 14th, Joaquin was murdered at my former high school. He was only 17 years old. He was one of 17 victims. The shooting lasted less than 7 minutes. I think that's important for people to reflect on. 34 people were injured. There were multiple security officers, cops. The cops didn't do anything. Then months later, the Supreme Court ruled that cops don't have to do anything to protect children if they feel personally threatened. So that's been really infuriating to deal with that reality. But when you have all this energy to do something for others, to be in service of others, and someone who was in that fight with you loses their life in a school, and you see, like, my brother and sister had survived the shooting, and I'd never seen them so angry and so sad. And when we started talking about what can we do, we really felt helpless. Like, I really felt like we had no route to do anything for all of these people in our community that we had lost. And like, if you look at, I don't know what you guys see when you look at these pictures, but I mean, I see friends, siblings, I see people I knew, I see people I tutored, I see people I coached in soccer. And so I realized that I leaned on my community college. I was in community college. I really studied mass media training. And I like to say I studied propaganda, because that's really what it is at the end of the day, marketing, advertising. And I just looked at how we talk about tragedies like this. And I understand, like, when I say tragedies like this, like Parkland was the most people killed in a high school, but this isn't truly an anomaly in America at all. And that was something that I understood very clearly, because the first thing I'd ever posted on Instagram was about Sandy Hook. And like I said, being born sort of like coming of consciousness post 9/11, perpetual tragedy is just like the name of the game. And so when something happens so local and so real, and you just start digging into, like, why could something like this happen, and you realize that, like, the media circus that comes with it, where there's endless cameras and they want to talk to every kid who wants to get in front of the camera and say something. And you see some kids go in front of the camera and start giving what they think happened the day of the shooting, and they weren't even like anywhere near the actual shooting, and they're conflicting like official reports, and you have all these headlines being generated where people don't click on them and they just see some single quote. One of the most horrific ones was like, one of the kids was like, "We just need to move on." And it was like a kid who had survived in the building where the shooting happened, and was like, "We just need to move on and like get on with it. Like, we have stuff to do, like in school, like reopen the school like less than a week after." And it was just so obvious to me, someone who'd been trained in sort of the way the media works, that like this was not going to help us stop this from happening to anyone ever again. This is going to keep happening. In fact, we understood that the media cycle would last exactly 2 weeks, and then they would move on. And so I got together with a group of my friends. I was called in. It wasn't really my idea, to go to my friend's living room, where we were discussing strategy, media strategy, and just different ideas for how we could get a message change. And one of the big things we realized is that every time this shooting happens, the shooter becomes the main subject and the central part of the story. And we wanted the victims to be, because we understood deeply that America has never given a shit about victims of anything unless it could serve some kind of political end. And we understood that even when that happens, they don't actually do what is necessary for those victims. And so we thought if we drew attention to the people who are most affected, the families, the survivors, the teachers, the realities of the people in the community, we could connect to other people who had been repressing their stories. because it's so hard in the immediate aftermath to come up with the words to describe any of this, because that's part of like why the media circus is there, because they need the authenticity of people stumbling through these things, and they want people to give the same, it's the same thing over and over and over again, where people are like, oh well, the shooter was this and that and blah blah blah, and if this would have happened, and like everyone's playing hypotheticals, and we had headlines generated that was like President Trump said that he would run into the building and save the kids, and like it's insane what is pushed as like the things that make people feel better after this. And so like while we were still going to funerals, I remember leaving funerals where there were local news cameras trying to get us to give quotes, just anyone to give a quote. And so we realized that we can't rely on conventional media to get our message across to people, that this has to change, that this can't be acceptable, that the pain that we are feeling cannot be felt by anyone else in this country or the world, because this sucks. Like there's no other way to approach what we were going through in that time. And so Cameron Kasky used his connections to CNN because he wrote an op-ed then like 2 days after the shooting happened. And so through that op-ed that he was able to get published, we organized a town hall, and the town hall allowed us to get our message across on a sort of uninterrupted format. But they still juxtaposed us, like people who had survived this thing, the community, and the NRA, which I thought was really crazy. And that was my first time interacting with the National Rifle Association, which to me has always been, not always, but in the last 30 years has been a PR wing for the military industrial complex. And so we had Dana Lash, who was the spokeswoman at the time. I think that she's been fired or left a long time ago. But she was there and she got booed, and she was saying that people were calling her a witch or whatever, but people were just booing her because she came there to represent the weapons industry that had made sure that the law in Florida was easily accessible for someone who should never have had access to a firearm, who had 40 something attempts or 40 something complaints to the FBI phoned in, but could still legally carry a semi-automatic weapon. And it's like just facing reality and dealing with the facts of the situation and saying like everyone has failed in this situation. The victims are failed. The person who believes that they need to pick up a gun to become famous is also failed. The media that makes that person famous in the aftermath, instead of highlighting the actual root causes of this violence, all the people are failed in this situation. And so after the town hall, I was invited to Washington, D.C., and we met with the members of Congress. And I always tell this story when I speak because they could have stopped us. Like they really could have stopped us, because we were still brainwashed enough to believe that our government was going to do something about this, at least to a degree, to like something that made sense. We were like, this something makes sense and they'll do something. But we met with everyone. We met with Paul Ryan and Lindsey Graham, and we met with like Dems and Republicans alike. And it just blew my mind how dumb the people who run this country are. Like just how they could not go toe to toe with us. And we had just started studying gun violence. We had just gone through this terrible thing and did some Google searches and read some polling, and we knew more about it than they did. And that was what came up over and over and over again. And then we had, it was just the series of events that really like juiced our confidence, because right after we went to Congress, we went to a town hall with a bunch of high schoolers and told them all this, and their minds were blown, and they were like organizing and doing walkouts. And this, like, at the same time, high schoolers and middle schoolers around the country are planning to walk out of their classrooms in solidarity with survivors of gun violence and to say to end gun violence. And March for Our Lives marches are being planned across the country. And so that's where I bring it to the call to leaderships, because I tell all that first act of everything, because I didn't feel like I was any sort of leader at the time. I just felt like I was being drawn in by my connections to my friends that I had wanted to be there for in the aftermath of this terrible thing. And it just sucked me into a position in which I was helping scheduling flights and helping people prepare to go on television and coming up with the messaging, and then meeting with members of Congress and having to facilitate those sort of conversations. And so, like I said, I felt powerless at first, but then as I realized the realities of modern power structures, I realized that, okay, the way things are, it will not serve us. We need to find a route, the fastest route that we can flip the table, that we can change the way that the people in power view the voices of young people. And so one of the first things we did was we connected with people on the front lines of anti-violence work. So the front lines of anti-violence work for me was, we met with the brave leaders of St. Sabina in Chicago. And so they flew down and they stayed at Emma Gonzalez's house. And we had a barbecue in their backyard, and they facilitated a training of Martin Luther King's principles of nonviolence. And when you're an American student, you read Martin Luther King, but you don't actually read Martin Luther King. You get a version of him that friends of mine called the Disney Dr. King. And so when we were handed quotes, we reread the letter from Birmingham jail as a small group, and it sounded like all of our parents. It sounded like Parkland. It sounded like people were but basically the worst people are the people who are okay with an unjust peace. And when we were planning, this is getting a little ahead of myself, but the march in Parkland was the largest protest in our town's history. Our town has 30,000 people, few roads and a gas station. It's really small, and it's mostly just private communities. But the main road was shut down because over 30,000 people were marching. They all came in from across the county. And the local headlines read that the March for Our Lives had prevented trash pickup, and had been part of why the community was dirtier this week. And I love hearing ridiculous statements like that, because you're able to take it and run with it and see where else it's been applied. And it's almost always Black Lives Matter protests and other disruptive, urgent protests that are calls for action, for urgent action. And they had been used to describe the civil rights movement and other liberation movements. So I was like, that's wild that they've come to they wouldn't even listen to these aggressively privileged middle class kids from Parkland about this issue, because they're starting to get afraid that we're actually going to acknowledge the realities of this. And so here's another MLK quote. This is a meme about how the NBA was going to print MLK quotes on their shirts, but they would never post these types of quotes. But yeah, it's when you actually read and reflect on not the pseudo history that we're taught in public schools in America, but the actual reality, the material realities of what's going on in this country, and you see what frontline thinkers were on about, you start to connect some of these dots about how you can actually create change. Here's a political cartoon from the 60s, how they described Martin Luther King, saying, "I plan to lead another nonviolent march tomorrow," as if all of his marches lead to mass violence. And it was just seeing that and seeing how there's a walkout south of us in Liberty City that was a mostly Black public high school that was walking out because 2 classmates had been shot and killed a week after Parkland. And we worked really hard from Parkland to try to amplify it to the media and get them to talk about it and try to connect the dot between gun violence that happened one day for 7 minutes in Parkland and gun violence that was happening every fucking week down 45 minutes south. And some people did connect the dots because of us posting and bullying reporters and you just screaming it over and over and over again. But there are still a lot of places where we came up short in that. And so the first major shift was that we determined that we needed to not only educate ourselves politically, because that was obviously urgent and necessary, but it was that we had to demonstrate public learning. Because if we could show and model that we were sort of changing as people from Parkland into principled politics of like, how do we actually prevent violence at its root cause, then I thought that if we were doing that with a diverse coalition where we weren't centering our own work and our own purpose, but like the actual work that was being done for decades before the shooting happened, and connected with these local groups and sort of redistributed some of the materials that we were getting as people who middle class and suburban people wanted to donate to, because these kids are so smart and they're figuring shit out. And celebrities were comfortable donating, but we had to make sure that there was an actual material like exchange between us and people who are actually doing the work on the front lines, not just people like us who are just mourning publicly and trying to figure out how to generate some form of change in a country that is built to just stagnate us. And so one of the things was political education through multiple demonstrations. So this is an example of a town hall I did in Oakland, California. Not Oakland, it was outside of Oakland, but my whole thing was that they wanted me to talk to mostly Democrat donors. And I said, I will not do that. I'm only going to talk to a room that is predominantly students, that it has to take place in an environment that students are comfortable. And if you're going to have a Democrat there, you need a community leader or someone else who can speak on this issue from more of a local standpoint. And so we had students speak, and they had Warriors coach Steve Kerr was there, and it generated a lot of headlines because it was a really dynamic conversation with a lot of students. One of the routes that we were convinced really early on would be a route for change was registering voters. And so this is a cool plaque I got for registering 1 million voters with head count. I like to show it because I think that it's wild how many people we were able to directly impact, but also how little of an actual like needle shift it makes, because it really shows you the structural limitations that are in play when a group of people can really revolutionize how we're registering people to vote. And I meet people who have been registering people to vote for 2 decades, and we're just changing the way that we do it, so much so to a T that we are completely shifting the framework of what they think is possible in the short term with digital organizing. And it still doesn't get us to the point of the actual holding of power that is necessary to actually create the change that we wanted. And so that's why part of the registration programs that we ran were linked to political education programs. So we did a lot of the registration at music venues and at places where people are not really don't really view themselves as political people, because we live in a country where you're kind of a lot of money and a lot of time is spent to turn people off from that, to really like ignore the things that don't directly affect you, or even if they do directly affect you, blame the wrong thing. Don't actually pay attention to the real forces at play. And so, so when we were registering people, it was really about trying to create more of a community. And so a lot of people who ended up leading the walkouts and leading town halls turned back into their community and organized a voting block locally, mostly of young people. This is a map of all the March for Our Lives that happened in the US. It was really important for us to have something that was accessible to people and that they could see action taken in their community. I really believe in repetition, and not repetition in the sense of like doing the same thing over and over again, but getting reps in the sense of like, okay, we actually have to do the thing that we've planned and actually test out some of this stuff and see how people react and learn from it. And so helping a lot of young people facilitate a local protest, and a protest in which they're giving speeches and facilitating literature and getting people registered to vote, and mostly led by young people. 90-something% of these were led by young people. It was super important to make sure that young people saw themselves as leaders, because we live in a country that doesn't want you to view yourself as a leader. That's why we have so many of these sort of like leadership development things that people opt into, because it's something that you can be trained and you can learn how to facilitate certain things. But at the end of the day, it's niche, it's narrow. They try to keep you in a certain capacity. And I want to just highlight how important it is to view the transferable skills that everyone has in everything we do. We're acquiring new skills, things that we are getting reps on, that we can help other people who may not have been able to put in much time into those skill developments. And so, yeah, that was the March for Our Lives in DC. I actually want to stay here. So one of the things we planned after the march in Washington was a tour of the country. And so we had 100 city tour for 63 days. I was on a bus. It was rough. But it was so multifaceted in the way that we wanted to really learn what America was. We had no real sense of what it was outside of Parkland and being like a kid tourist in places. And so we went by ground on a bus from city to city, meeting with local organizers, meeting with people who are actually fighting this fight for way longer than we were, people who are mourning. We spent Father's Day with Michael Brown Sr., Michael Brown's father in Ferguson. We met with Philando Castile's mom in Minneapolis. We went to Standing Rock. We really wanted to use the spotlight that was put on the sort of kid celebrities, the kid celebrity survivors, and highlight the actual realities of this country, because so many things were being ignored. And if we could draw the line between Parkland, Ferguson, Newtown, Standing Rock, and the border, and youth incarceration, and all these different forms of violence that were taking place, then maybe we can actually do something to create a unique coalition of people who can actually implement through direct action and mutual aid and life-sustaining work, actual change. And so yeah, on the tour, we met with some incredible people. Like I said, reading Martin Luther King Jr., one of the beautiful and harsh things about history is it's meant to feel far away. We're not really meant to feel like it's happening right now. And people always say the really dumb shit about like, oh, history will remember you like this or whatever. And like, I really don't like that, because you have to put work in for history to reflect in a certain way. That's like the whole point of books like War and Peace, where it's like a lot of people working hard to make history. But so one of the things, one of the people we met, one of the most incredible people we met, was Harry Belafonte. And Harry Belafonte is 90 plus years old and was, if you're not unfamiliar, an incredible singer who he helped finance the civil rights movement. And he just challenged our beliefs and really challenged us and made us reflect and helped us reflect on what we had seen, like I said, in juvenile prisons and at the border and at all these different places around the country. But we were in a lot of places that were like Parkland, that were gated communities, that neighbors didn't trust each other, that it was mostly conservative, but a lot of kids wanted to change things, but didn't necessarily know how. And he just really helped us dispel more of the myths on how change occurs in this country. And one of the things he did was he handed me a book called Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, and told me, because I said something about understanding that violence is in so many different forms than what we are calling it. And I love this quote: "Sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect that core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit in with that core belief." And he obviously goes into more about how our minds are colonized. And his mentor, Amis Caesar, talks about how colonization as a form of organizing one's society turns the individuals within the society into savages. And I love this quote where he's talking about, I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to paraphrase, but it's like, it's a lucid poem in discourse on colonialism that y'all should read if you haven't read it. It's not that long. But he makes this very like big comparison to basically people who are colonizing the entire world and Hitler. And he talks about how when the Gestapo and the torturers get to go to the water cooler and talk and refine and exchange their ideas, the rich and the people who have not been paying attention will say, "Oh my God, this is Nazism. This is terrible. This is new." And it's part of the core root of how we organize society, how we punish each other, how we treat each other, how we organize our behavior, how we organize our social lives in a colony. And so, yeah, next slide. The United States of trauma. Yeah, so Fanon talks about the trauma of colonialism on young people in The End of Wretched of the Earth, where he's interviewing young European kids and young Algerian kids about just how they view each other. And I saw a lot of what we had experienced traveling the country, of this violence, this trauma leaves people not trusting each other. And so you can't have shared space, and it's hard to exchange materials, and it's hard to learn from each other if you can't be vulnerable and honest. And so I thought it was really important for us as people from Parkland who could afford. One of the first things we did was we raised a shit ton of money for mental health services. And when I say we, I mean like me and my friends. Like I was the oldest one who was raising money, and we paid for like the mental health support for this entire community for months. And we actually developed and helped raise the money for the long-term care center that's here, that's still taking care of people, that I even went to not too long ago because I'm back in Parkland during COVID. And so through that process of watching like the town just not be able to raise any money in one of the richest like towns in Florida was a wild, wild feeling to see people like really hoard their resources in times of tragedy, when it's really mythologized that Americans wouldn't do that. It's just not true. And that's what I saw. And so it took a bunch of kids, the most sympathetic actors in the process, to get people to actually change. And so meeting with politicians and nonprofits where they ignored survivors really made me challenge the structure. I started to see the connection of issues. Our org, March for Our Lives, became a lot more like those corporations rationalizing their existence that was getting in the way of more radical and urgent organizing. A movement is necessary, but a movement will not be a 501c3 or a C4. These are just tools that can be utilized like any other, but should not be the central medium for change, especially corporatized nonprofits. The movement must take material action in which people like us, all of us on this call, myself included, who have time to think and converse on the benefits of and contemporary tactics of revolutionary activity, must give our time and creativity to liberatory causes, or we will continue to see violence monopolized and trauma ignored. So that's really where I went wrong in a lot of my organizing, and where I tried to make a change as I took a step back from March for Our Lives and I went back to college. I went to the New School. I worked on the Sanders campaign, writing policy. And last summer, I raised money for bail efforts to bail out protesters who were getting arrested protesting police violence. I did first aid at protests. I leaned back into the service so that I could continue to educate myself and reflect on my own trauma that I had started to accumulate in these organizing spaces, being on the front lines, having people come after me with guns and try to threaten my life, working 100-hour plus a week. And I started to realize like how just you have to admit and self-criticize and really start to build from that and share these lessons that people like myself and other people who have been organizing for the last few years can relate to. And even though there's historic change that has occurred, we have to reflect on sort of the momentum and where it's at. And so what I see a lot of the time in the democratic messaging around gun violence right now, which was a thing that I personally helped change through so many different types of actions, is I see leaning back on the sort of war on drugs rhetoric becoming a war on guns rhetoric, in which police become more of the solution. And so I see my role as an educator in the gun violence space, and as someone who gun violence prevention organizers may turn to for advice on how to talk about these things. I always say that if police violence is not talked about, if we're not talking about the daily violence that the state has monopolized against mostly poor people, houseless people, minorities, women, we aren't actually combating gun violence. If we're only talking about the daily mass shooting or the 50 suicides a day or the 100+ gun casualties, but we're not talking about how the largest employment base of domestic abusers is the police department, or the fact that a cop kills every 8 hours in America, is troubling. And so one of the things I always talk about now, and something I've been trying to like form in an essay or something, I don't know what medium to communicate this story in, because it's long and it goes over lots of time, but it's in Minneapolis. We were there, and I said we talked to Philando Castile's mom. Philando Castile was a dad who was killed on Facebook Live by a cop who he legally had a firearm, who he said that he had it, and they shot him over it. And his mom was just so strong, and it's all the things people say about people who are urgent and in direct action. She raises money to pay for school lunches. She helps art projects and art museums get built up for young people who are experiencing this shit. And we were talking to her a day after another 19-year-old was shot and killed, Thurman Blevins, leaving a party because the cops thought he had a gun. And that's what they say, but I'm not gullible, and I hope you guys aren't gullible either. And you start to really question these realities, because when I met with organizers that next day and they were telling me we need to abolish the police, a lot of kids from Parkland really struggled with hearing that, because we had, like Fanon said, had these myths that we were holding on to about what cops actually did. Some of us were related to police officers, and we were like, well, they're not bad people. But then we reflect and you think, and you start to realize that it's not about individual people. We can be kind to individual people, but be ruthless to these systems that justify and rationalize violence. And so when we were afraid to talk about police violence early on, it was the most urgent time that we should have been doing that. And I've seen so many of my friends and colleagues be on panels where they bring up that simple stat about domestic violence, where I can't quote it directly, but it's like 2 in 5 families self-report domestic violence by police officers. And just by saying that, they've been kicked off panels, and they've been like silent, and their mic's been cut off, and in mostly these spaces with people who don't want to hear shit that's real. And so, like I said, it's important for people like us who can actually deal and actually face and struggle with reality and share our individual experiences and create a collective perspective on what is going on. We have to take material action and actually donate our time and our creativity to this. And so, like I said, I saw how all this stuff was connected. This is on the right. It's terrible facilities at the border that were, I don't know if this one specifically, but something that I learned from Dream Defenders, who are an incredible organization in South Florida, who organize mostly Black Floridians, but they're just on the front lines of so much incredible abolition work and organizing work, was Geo Group, this company that has ties to John Kelly and the Trump administration, and all these other people are like basically buying abandoned buildings and making these makeshift cages and prisons, and just how profitable it was. And then I connected it back to how every juvenile detention center in Florida is privatized now, for the most part, and how that is affecting how that actually directly impacted relationships that people had with the police in their schools and how police were walking in our schools and criminalizing students. And I remember how terribly racist the cop was at Stoneman Douglas, who then in the act of actually needing to do his job of actually protecting people, he didn't do it. And so, and then the Supreme Court protects him and says he doesn't actually have to do that thing, because it is kind of ridiculous that we'd send someone in with any kind of military equipment or any type of weapon to combat a person who's sought out to kill students. And so, but when we connect these things, that most of our economy in the US is dedicated to war, that is dedicated to military action, that is dedicated to incarceration and trying to monopolize violence, you start to connect the dots between the people who are the Parkland shooter and Kyle Rittenhouse in Kenosha and Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis, and all of these people who feel, who act on what is being taught and reinforced by the core of the US. And so I said, I'm just checking my notes. I said, when most of our economy goes towards defense, defense in quotes, those weapons get handed to cops that then test them on poor people to unload the clip on protesters. Professor Dylan Rodriguez talks about the police structure being that of an occupying power, sustaining war with our greater population. I'm paraphrasing. His work's really great. You should check it out. Rapper Denzel Curry says we're living in colonies, which brings me back to the Fanon example, where we talk about how do you actually break free and actually start to acknowledge reality. And that's where I talk about unique coalitions. And that's really where we have to dedicate our time, our energy, and our service to start to actually build relationships with people, so that it's not just this one stop, like cry circle where we met with people on the road in all these different places, and we're talking about our experience with gun violence, and it's great, and we're getting it. Maybe it helps some people heal, but there has to be a commitment to deeper community building. There has to be some kind of shared principles and education, so that we're actually building momentum through our stories, through our connectivity. And so this is just two examples of different actions. This is protest and mutual aid, sustaining and disrupting. That to me is the two biggest pillars in how we are able to create significant movement work. So I made a short list. Brandon asked me to make a short list of concrete things people can do, because he said that was something that maybe not many people have talked about in these sessions, but since I'm bringing it to a close, I don't know, I just want to create this small list. So create small working groups. It's not about just a reading book club or something. It's about theory and practice. It's like actually reflecting on your own skills, seeing who you have alignment with or who you can build alignment with, and actually starting to be accountable to each other in different ways. You build this relationship over time. You can't just jump into it. You can't just make it like the same type of structure as a corporate hierarchy. There has to be agency, and there has to be a committed practice that's actually reflecting on individual power structures that people are bringing into these spaces and these working groups, so that you can actually disrupt the outside spaces. Educate yourself and others about work currently being done and how to step in. Every issue is being worked on in some capacity. Whether or not they're doing the quote unquote right thing is not the point. It's that people have made these relationships over time, and you can't just walk into different places that and take charge or anything, or like try to tell people they're doing things incorrectly, which was a huge experience of a lot of my peers that were frustrated by people who were committed to like petition work or ballot measures that we felt were overall a waste of money, when we needed to buy gun locks and help people who were dealing with daily violence and first aid kits and all these different things that were more on the front lines of these issues. but a lot of the people that were pushing us into different spaces wanted us to continue doing electoral work, and not just electoral work, but sort of broad democratic electoral work. And so when we got into the specific issues and specific policies, we were able to find groups that were primed to do that work, that could actually apply pressure to the mayor, to the state rep, to the congressman, because change can only come from these unique coalitions that are like, when you see a bunch of these different groups pushing the same thing in different ways, that's really where the momentum is going to come from. So then I say, develop your own tools to organize your community, trace your experiences with violence, and bring others like you to participate in revolutionary activities. So this is a lot of, like I've said earlier with Fanon, but it's about actually seeing and committing to the imagination of what is needed, what is actually needed, not just looking at the materials that you currently have and trying to reflect from your own position what you can do in the short term, or just the small sort of steps you can take in the day-to-day life, but actually how you can build that unique coalition from yourself out in a way that you are actually sharing and redistributing your time, your creativity to these different efforts that are on the front lines of these things that can actually disrupt and actually build up more power. And so that's really the core principles of organizing. And it's in place in so many different ways. If you look at tenant unions or labor unions or democratic or local political parties or third parties and even nonprofits, like all these different structures do similar stuff, but a lot of them aim to work within the system. And there has to be a commitment to, at the very least, work outside and inside, and not center the inside work, because that's what this whole thing does. It rationalizes itself. It makes itself needed. And so we're not questioning why do we accept, why, instead of saying like, just why are people okay with gun violence, actually dealing with who is allowing this to happen, actually attacking the forces of evil that are perpetuating the harm. And so I name revolutionary activities explicitly because I think it's necessary to not be afraid to step into the idea that you are going to be a bringer of change, or that the work that you're going to do is actually going to change things. I think a lot of the time people are afraid to commit to that, even if they admit that things are urgent and things are necessary now, that things need to change in the short term, long term, or we're doomed or fucked or whatever you want to say. And so when I see a lot of old people say shit like, "Oh, your generation's gonna save us," and and all this stuff, and I'm like, no, it has to be a multi-generational coalition of people actually pushing this, and we need everyone to haul their weight for this, because it doesn't actually take that much to create change. It's a small dedicated group of people who are acting on principles and in this direct action and putting theory and practice together, and are working to, through their demonstrations, through their political demonstrations, politically educating people. And so yeah, that's pretty much it. I got the breakout questions. Do you want me to just read through this?
Well, Matt, first of all, thank you so much for sharing your journey, over the last few years in organizing people around the world. Actually, it's a global movement. So I just want to pause there and thank you, and affirm you sharing your story. We have about 25 minutes. You brought a lot to the forum here in how interconnected, what you've been experiencing over the years in terms of what started off as a gun violence movement, has led to justice movements across the board, voting rights, racial justice, ending police violence. There's so much on the table here. I thought maybe it would be healthy for us just to take a few moments before we break out to see if anyone has any questions or comments or other considerations for you. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So
Sorry.
yeah, let me pause there. Does anyone have any questions for Matt about what he shared here in the last hour? Well, people are organizing their thoughts. I want to share that Matt. I don't know if I ever told you this, but I was in DC for the march, and I was running a program with Northern Irish youth workers. So we had 15 youth workers, almost all of whom were victims or worse in the Troubles, and they were with me at the time. And I was actually in the airport waiting for them to arrive when a plane full of survivors, victims, and community members arrived into Dulles. And I've not really seen such a revolutionary moment in my life, actually. I think a lot of these folks, you know, I don't know their stories, don't know who they were, but the entire airport stopped, just stopped. Everybody was cheering, applauding, clapping, crying. And, you know, on reflection, I think a lot of that had to do with not because of who they were or what they had, you know, what you had gone through, but the fact that you were taking those next action steps, that you had left your community, you were coming to DC, you were starting a movement, that there was something going on that was being created in real time, and we were bearing witness to that. So I just want to thank you for being a part of that and for reminding us that you know, change takes action. Change takes doing something. Change takes some sort of motion, because for so many of us, whether we're politically active or not, it's a lot easier to not be mobile. And you know, you continually remind me that it takes motion. So I'll stop there. Anyone have any questions for Matt before we go into breakouts?
I think Sky has a question there. Long-winded questions are welcome.
So Sky asks, Sky, do you want to ask it?
Sorry, I didn't know that we could speak out loud, so I just like typed it. So it was pretty long-winded, but my friends and I have seen this news article about this Senate bill trying to be passed about just overall limiting trans youth to health access or health care, along with making it a thing to where teachers have to out their students to their parents about either just being gender nonconforming or trans in general, which is like not really an okay thing to out children at that young age if they don't like, if they're non-conforming. And my friends and I have been talking about things that we can try and do to protest against this bill, but we're not entirely sure how we can tackle that situation, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I think yes, healthcare incredibly important. Anything that's in like stopping and preventing people, anyone. Obviously, all these bills that have happened, we're seeing it across the country, trying to limit trans youth healthcare. Yeah, I think that I'm always an advocate of disruptive protest. So I would just say to try to first build your group out, reflect on the idea that like the people you're talking to right now, I don't know how many people you're referring to when you talk about like your friends are trying to protest this, but it can really be like 2 or 3 people to start out, but just start reflecting on who else you can bring in, if you can bring in more people, and start to just have those meetings about brainstorming sessions and doing individual research and group research on how things have been stopped in the state legislature in North Carolina in the past. See other groups that have been protesting state legislature actions, what they've done, what you think's worked, what you think hasn't, and really be medium agnostic, like be as open with what is the form of protest or direct action, what it has to be. It could just be building out a list of hundreds of students that aren't going to turn in an assignment or are going to like go on a school strike or something, or it could be a walkout, or it could be posting stuff around town and building posters out and having people text into something. And it, like, there are so many different ways to get people connected to other people who are doing the work, so that you can continue to take input in and just try to find these direct ways to disrupt these individual people who are perpetuating this harm, right? Because it is a small group of people that you're organizing against that are supported by these greater power structures that, like I said, are run by dumb people. So like they're not actually really creative and as fluid with their tactics. And so when you create something that makes them talk about things differently, or respond to something, or have to just approach any, like I said, anything differently. Like if there was a way to just post a poster somewhere in North Carolina that made people think that this bill does something really horrific, which it does, but something very explicitly horrific that like the news runs with, or you can post on social media, like those are the sorts of ideas I have, because then I always just imagine the politician after having to give a quote or something, and then it just starts to snowball down, and then you control the message. The trick is to try to move the goalpost towards your side of the argument, to get people to see your sympathetic actors as people, as people who are needed, who need service of other people to actually step up and do something, and giving people these sort of concrete steps on what to do. And at first it might just be filling in a Google form and getting people to commit to a Zoom call or a brainstorm session. And that might just start to roll into more things. But I always press people to try to do the more disruptive action than the more like quantitative action. Like I think a lot of people try to do like petition signings, which can be effective in some cases, but in a lot of cases at this point in time, they haven't been. And a lot of people just do like phone banking, which can be successful if it's leading to an extended list of people building out and more people signing on to something and actually putting material interest forward and behavioral interest forward. But I always challenge people to, I think a 5-person sign drop that gets attention, or a small act of whatever to block the legislature or something by whatever that is. I think that is always more of a mobilization moment. And when you can get people to, when you can create action that's replicable too on the local level, whether it's like posting pictures or challenging their neighbors or doing whatever, like a walkout, like things that people can do around the people that they need to convince of this, are always things that I lean into. But again, like I'm just one person, and I would always defer to finding people in North Carolina who are organizers, who are disruptors, who are creatives, that could help you or you and your friends start to step into your power and start to actually find ways to act on it.
And Matt, I would just add to that, and Sky, that one of the things I think in the past probably 5 years at ECU that I'm proud of is that we've tried to cultivate a healthy culture of nurturing student protest and promoting that, and making sure that there are obstacles removed for students to share their voices. And I think that's been a good partnership between student leaders and university leaders, university administrators, and that's been healthy. I think, like speaking from a university administration side, we see that as a really valuable educational opportunity for students, and healthy. And so anyway, Sky, I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and I hope you'd find support from folks within student affairs and my department in particular, but to be able to do that and to make sure your voice is heard. So if there's ways that we can help you, please reach out.
Thanks, Sky. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Matt. Maybe time for one more question before we break out. I want to make sure that folks have time to ask Matt you some questions in case we run short here in the end. Did I see, Leah, did you have a question or a comment earlier?
Yeah, I'd love to ask a question if that's all right. I'm kind of a guest here and I don't want to take time away from students too much, but I'd love to ask a question. Okay. So, well, you've spoken about sort of the media circus in Parkland after the shooting being such a shit show, and how the media, you know, shows up in these sort of ugly and aggressive ways around tragedy, around everything. And I guess, and then you spoke a little bit in that, as you were answering Sky's question about how the media is useful in a way to sort of push politicians. And I would just love to hear a little bit more about your relationship and your work with the media. We, a huge piece of our work is making the situation on Pine Ridge and for Indigenous Americans more visible. And, you know, we sort of had this moment some years ago when Standing Rock was huge and it was national news and international news. And it was such a relief to have, you know, some airtime and to have white Americans even acknowledge that Indigenous Americans were still here. And then, of course, things moved along and it became a story of the past. But so anyway, that's just what I'm thinking about. And I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about your relationship with the media, or like how I mean, we all know that the media is awkward and twisted, but how it's useful to you. I guess that's what I'd love to hear. Thank you.
Great question. So yeah, like I said, I wanted to be a filmmaker from an early age, and I was actually president of TV production at my high school. So I did like the school news, and so I had a lot of experience like making news packages. But a lot of what I had done was comedy based. I was using satire a lot of the time because I knew that no one watched it. So I thought if I made myself laugh and my friends laugh, like it was fine. So I developed a lot of different practices, and I was able to work throughout Broward County. I covered all the sporting events for my school. I helped like the mayor do different promotional videos and things. So I got to build relationships with a lot of the local people who actually did like the day work around news coverage. So when like the shooting happened, I saw a lot of people that I had either run into before or I knew how to talk to. And so even when, so like I could also see through the bullshit of like the opportunism of it all, where it's like, oh, like they're like, I remember meeting, there's one of the earlier spin things that they were trying to throw out was Fox News was trying to say that the CNN town hall had given us pre-written questions to try to say that basically CNN was controlling what we were saying. And they found a kid who went to Douglas who was saying that, who was okay saying that on TV. And Parkland is so small that like I just was walking down the street and I ran into him. I ran into this kid, Colin, who was saying this thing on TV. And I was like, Colin, do you really believe that? Like, I worked on this town hall. Like, I was on the calls with people who were producing it. And I helped write a lot of the research behind a lot of my friends' questions. Like, we worked really hard, and I don't want you to erase our work that we contributed to this. And he's like, yeah, but they wouldn't let me read my question. And they changed it all around, and he showed me his question, and it was like it was 4 pages that was basically a tribute to one of the victims, and who was Aaron Feist, who was someone who I really admired at my school. He was a football coach, and it was mostly a tribute, and it was very clear that CNN cut out all of the tribute and left like the question part that was like and like changed his words to make it make sense without the tribute. And I was like, the question they gave you was basically what you were saying, just without all the other stuff. And he was like, yeah, but that's the stuff I really wanted to say. And I was like, I hear you, man. Like, I would love for you to say these really nice things about Coach Feist. But CNN's not going to let us say what we want to say all the time, because they have their MO that they want us to feel like this is some kind of like civil political discussion. And I knew it wasn't going to be that way because The adults were actually the rowdy ones, because I feel like the kids were told to we were used to like, okay, be quiet, be respectful for whatever thing to get what we want. But the parents were just like screaming and hooting and hollering at like senators and like really like giving it to them at the town hall. And so like that, I mean, CNN wanted to push my friend off the program. They wanted to stop a few people who were survivors from asking questions because they thought it was too uh, controversial. Cameron Kasky's question that became like the headliner, where he asked Marco Rubio to stop taking money from the NRA. They wanted to cut that. So like we had to threaten walking out in mass with a bunch of students that they had booked and promoted and whatever, to get our what we thought was the priority forward. And so while the media is a way, like I believe in like there is a value to shared eyes on things, like eyes limited. The rapper Mavi says eyes limited are worthless, but it's just like, it's also just understanding that like it's in service of this greater thing. Like Jake Tapper won an award for the town hall that like they were gonna fuck up if we didn't bully them into making it something that was real. And it's really funny to me, but yeah, but then you meet people behind the scenes, and you talk to people in the offices and the producers and some of the video people and the day laborers, and I can speak that language because I did that work. And I was a freelance journalist, so when I would travel different places and meet different people, they could just relate to some of my crazy stories, and they were able to see us more as people and less as like subjects or products. But I've had so many times I went on CNN. There was a day in Dallas where we talked to like Proud Boys and got them to agree with us and be really emotional and cry on camera with us. And CNN wanted to play the footage before I spoke. And I said, don't platform these people. Like even if you think the video is nice and all heartfelt and everything, you're still putting someone who is okay flying Nazi flags in public on your channel for people to recognize in the future and see, and for him to post and promote his club and whatever. And they promised me they wouldn't do it. And right before I spoke, they played the full clip and unedited. And I'm pissed. If you find that interview, you can find me being like, I'm very angry right now. And they apologized. And my interviews on live TV have been consistent, where they either mix me up with my brother, who's 2 years younger than me and survived the shooting, and I had graduated, so I wasn't in the building, I wasn't at the school. And so they try to paint me as a survivor of the shooting, and that creates a lot of havoc because people then run with it on the internet and say that I'm perpetuating that when it's MSNBC and CNN. And yeah, it's really difficult when you're on live TV and they're just apologizing for fucking up to you, and that's like half your interview, and then the other half is like their bullshit talking point. And so when I went to, I got to go to the first debate for the Dems down here in Florida, and Chuck Todd asked a terrible gun question, and you can hear me booing when he asked it, like in the audience, because I was so fucking angry that they would ask a question that could have been written by the NRA. And so overall, I think the media is a net negative, but my feelings in it, like anything, like with the nonprofits I talk about, and with reform like-minded groups, these are all tools, and they all have to be implemented in different disruptive ways. And so like I have a bunch of friends who make films and art, and like people I know at Now This, and do mini documentaries and write in television, and all they are dedicated to doing is sort of using their place in this to dispel the myths. But what happens is the dispelling of myths creates a credibility around the product itself, so that people start to take in other myths. And so even if a show or a movie has a principle and people can act on it and take it in, the greater story a lot of the times gets watered down through how it's promoted, or how the film's talked about, or what's prioritized. So yeah, that's been my experience. I've had so many art projects and movie projects and things like fall apart because of like literally NRA backed people getting in the room and being like, pulling the money and getting like Viacom to pull the money from something, and getting like all these, and like there's this mental health group that's basically funded by GOP PACs that goes into spaces and talks about like, oh no, if you talk about gun violence, like it's going to make people more sad, so you shouldn't talk about it. And so like instead of, so they're like, that's really where I see a lot of it. But I also have a lot of friends who are working their asses off to infiltrate and disrupt and try to improve. But I believe firmly in manufactured consent. I think that that I saw it with my own eyes in Nevada when I was working for Bernie Sanders, when he won the primary there in a landslide, and MSNBC compared it to Nazis winning. And I was like, whoa, wait, what? And that guy who compared the Bernie Sanders to Nazis got fired 2 weeks later for being creepy to women. But it doesn't matter, because some old people who are, the average voter watches 6 hours of television a day, and they take in that comment and it enforces something, or it sticks with them. And if you look at the media around Super Tuesday, it was like $200 million of like pro Biden media was given by like the major networks, because who owns these major networks? And like you get really close to the same sort of conspiracy theories that people lean into that tend to be anti-Semitic or anti-immigrant. But there is a small group of people who run a lot of these different organizations and these groups that are perpetuating harm against mass people. And a lot of those big legacy media companies are some of the first line defenders for spinning the truth out of it. When I went to Ferguson with my people from Parkland, and we were meeting with Mike Brown's family, and we saw how small the community was, that Ferguson is less than 20,000 people. Parkland is 30,000 people and takes up a much bigger area of land, actually. And so a lot less people, but living closer together. And it was like maybe a couple blocks in total of an entire place. And they made it feel like, the news made it feel like Ferguson was going to burn America to the ground. And we have to reflect on who is that actually serving. Does it help us understand the pain of people in Ferguson, or are we making their pain look dangerous? And that's what a lot of it does. And so I think that what was different about us was we weren't afraid to call it out and to stand in sort of like the privilege of being the white kids dealing with this, and say that this doesn't affect us that long, and our trauma is terrible. So imagine what people who don't have mental health stuff are going through. But yeah, sorry, long-winded answer. But overall, my experience with the media is that when you bully them, stuff can work, and when you don't, things just, it's passive, terrible shit.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Everything. Yeah.
Leah, appreciate the question. And actually probably a really healthy way to wrap up. Unfortunately, we're not going to have time for breakout questions because we're kind of at the end of our 90-minute session here. But I want to thank Matt again for all of the interconnection that you bring to joy and justice in this world. I'm always impressed and inspired by your motion, and that, you know, one movement leads into and connects with another one, and that in many ways we should be seeing all of these movements together. I'll also say that I think having now gone in these sessions from Northern Ireland to Berlin, to Pine Ridge, down to Parkland, when we look at extremism, there's connections there. There's significant intersections between how extremism happens around the world and who it is that perpetuates violence. So it's in solving and in responding to conflict, I think maybe one lesson I'm taking from this is that there's also intersectionality within violence and within structural extremism, and we should be conscious of that. So, Matt, again, thank you so much for your time, for your movement building, and many thanks to all of the presenters over the course of the last month, and many thanks to the ECU community for welcoming our friends, our network, our social capital into your community. Again, Dennis, thank you so much. I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Brandon. I'll just echo your thanks to Matt and also Leah for last week and all of our partners. We're looking forward to really continuing these partnerships with you all, and you know, this is where we do our best work, when we're connected with each other in meaningful ways. And you know, one, I think, silver lining of this pandemic is it has allowed us to connect with change makers in different ways, and put you in front of our students and community members. So I'm thankful for that, thankful for those connections. And you know, I think the best way to end is to be continued. So so thank you all so much, and hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you.